I'm not really accustomed to public speaking, as you probably well know, and I'm not as well prepared as everybody else. My writing is too small, so I'm going to use my glasses. Good afternoon, Chancellor, distinguished guests, university staff, and most of all the graduates that are here to celebrate today. You're probably thinking it's a bit odd that I'm standing here, and I feel exactly the same way. Usually if I'm on stage and I have a microphone anywhere near me, I'm screaming at people, but I'm going to spare you that today. Instead, they've just given me an honorary degree, and some of you are graduating with honors, so I'd like to talk about what honor actually means to me. I was born in a place called Cowcaddens, a working class suburb near the centre of Glasgow in Scotland. Glasgow, if you don't know it, is a very tough town. In fact, Billy Connolly was quoted as saying that Glasgow is so tough that if you see a cat with a tail in it, it's a tourist. That's one of my favourite quotes. But I wasn't only born in a tough town, I was born into a tough family. It was a family that thought that really that school was a bit of a waste of time because I was never going to use it. And so they had to, the most they had to look forward to really was a lifetime of working in the shipyards. And there was a lot of honor in hard work, don't get me wrong. I think that's a very respectful thing to do. But unfortunately, even in those days, even the shipyards didn't have many jobs, so a lot of people were out of work. So my grandfather took up bare knuckles fighting in the back alleys of Glasgow. He was doing 30, sometimes 40 rounds of brutal fighting. And he'd come home battered and bruised with a pocket full of cash. He's made a lot of money. And it was his way of earning respect, was fighting. He'd come home and he'd buy breakfast for all the kids in the street, and that made him, a hero. And then he'd go to the pub and spend the rest of the money, and we'd all starve for the rest of the week. But for that moment, he was a hero, and it was his version of honor. Everybody has a different take on this. My dad wasn't well educated. He was very street smart, but he wanted to be a boxer too. And he became the amateur featherweight champion of Scotland. He was a very good fighter. But he didn't want to turn professional because the sport was too corrupt. It was dishonorable. It wasn't honorable. So when came time for him to hang up his gloves and leave that honorable, noble art of boxing, he took a job as an enforcer for the local gangsters. They say there's honor among thieves and all that sort of stuff. I'm not so sure about that, but that's another story. That's probably the future that my dad thought I would have. He wanted me to use my fists to smash down all the doors that was, usually slamming in our faces. But luckily for me, when I was, 5 years old, my family left Glasgow and we emigrated to sunny South Australia. That's what the ads in Scotland would say. And we came to Adelaide. And after living for a few years in migrant hostels, we finally settled in a new satellite city called Elizabeth. It was the city of the future at the time. And initially, I went to school there, and primary school for me really was a way of escaping violence at home. It was, it was the only place I felt safe. But I got to school and I sort of forgot about home, and I was like a sponge. I took everything in. I wanted to learn and grow to be a better person, but it didn't take long really till it wore me down, all the problems at home, and I felt doomed to the same dead end as my parents and my grandparents, living day to day, hand to mouth, struggling to make ends meet, and then giving up and eventually disappearing. I lost hope. And I lost interest in school. And all I remember hearing from everyone was, hurry up and finish, go and get a job. Any job will do, And apparently that was as much honor as people like us deserved. So I quit school midway through year 10, which I deeply regret. And I went and I pumped petrol until I found an apprenticeship at pouring molten metal, which was really a lot of fun in the midsummer. As a young Scotsman, it nearly killed me. And about that time, I started getting in with the wrong crowd. They were taking lots of drugs and drinking, and there was a lot of fighting. And I was sort of just doing all this to escape, trying not to feel the pain that was still burning inside me from my childhood. And I remember, on one of our outings, walking through the city looking for trouble. I walked past a university up the road from here, and I remember stopping, and I'd stood, all my mates were looking for trouble, and I looked at it, and I wondered what it was like, to be a student in there. I just thought it would have been fabulous. But it was only for good people. It wasn't for people like us, honorable people. I was the other kind. I was the kind that couldn't, get through the front gate. They wouldn't let me through the front gate. So eventually, I jumped the fence. And that's literally, I jumped the fence. I remember they had a university ball with a rock band playing there one night. And my mates and I jumped the fence and crashed the party. And while my friends were shuffling around, literally looking to start trouble, I was sort of walking around and looking through windows and sort of wondering what it would like to have the honor to be able to study in there. And as it turned out, I was one of the lucky ones. I wasn't destined to end up in jail like a lot of my friends. I met a bunch of guys who had plans. They wanted to actually be something, and they wanted to make music that touched people's souls. And it wasn't long before their dreams became my dreams as well. And music transported us all to a better place. It sounds really corny, but music literally set us free. It was incredible. And it was around that same time that I, just after we started, that I met the girl of my dreams. I met my wife, Jane. And Jane, when I met Jane, my life changed even more. We were literally two worlds colliding. And Jane, she loved poetry and literature, and she couldn't believe that I'd missed out on all that. So she she wanted to share it all with me. And so she started doing things like she went out, and when I was in my early 20s, she bought me a copy of Shakespeare for Children, written by Charles and Mary Lamb. And it was like a light was switched on. I'm going, is that what this guy's writing about? This is incredible. And it opened up this whole new world to me, and I loved it. Every time Jane gave me a book, I went away and I wrote a song, or I wrote a story. And I found that the more I read, the more I was inspired, and the more the world started to actually make sense to me. It was a life-changing event. Maybe things didn't have to stay the same for me as they had for my dad after all. Maybe there were other lives I could lead, other choices I could make. Eventually, I got lots of professional honors, they all came my way, gold records, plaques, statue awards, you name it. And I was grateful for them all, but it never really changed the way I felt about myself inside. It was about 6 years ago, I realized that I had to deal with my past if I was going to have any sort of future. And it was a frightening prospect to me, but I couldn't do it alone. I got the help of a really great therapist, and anybody who's having trouble with life, I recommend it. I honestly believe that, I've always been one of those guys who tries to beat his chest and act tough and stuff like this. I honestly believe the most courageous thing I ever did was put my hand up and say I needed help. And so that day changed my life. But I also had the understanding and the help of a beautiful family and my beautiful wife, Jane. And I started making sense of all the things I'd been through. So I started to write it down at the same time. It was painful, and but every page I wrote, I felt like it was a weight lifted off my shoulders, and I felt lighter. Eventually, I sat with the final manuscript for my first book, Working Class Boy, and just for a minute, I thought, nah, I'll just burn it. It's not that good. And, it's like old habits, they die hard. But I had to let go of those old habits if I was going to change. So I released the book, and that act of letting go actually changed my life once and for all. And I became a better person. I know it. But like everybody in this room, I'm still work in progress. So, I hope for the best. So yes, it is odd that I'm standing here today, but it's not for all the obvious reasons. In Glasgow and in Elizabeth, the only degree we ever got was a third degree. Options for honour were limited to us and distorted, so a lot of us decided to run away. I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about there, many of you won't. But I guess what I'm trying to say is now I understand that despite this magnificent occasion and honour, it's not actually something an honour is not something that can be actually bestowed on you. It's a feeling you have to cultivate in yourself. We have to create honor in our lives every day by what we do, by what we work on, what we create, and how we relate to others. It's something that grows inside you, and only grows through a lot of hard work. And that's the truth of it. Caps and gowns are really great, and I'm really happy to have one. But the symbols are something much more grand than that. So congratulations to each and every one of you guys. The honors you receive today recognize what you're capable of achieving when you refuse to let anyone's limitations of you stop you. May you continue to strive for that kind of honor in everything you do in the years ahead. And finally, thanks to the University of South Australia for granting me this honor. I'm very emotional about it. I accept it on behalf of all the auto workers in Elizabeth, the petrol pumpers, and the guys at Pour Molten Metal who weren't lucky enough to escape. May their children and their grandchildren have the opportunity to enter great institutions like this one through the front gate and not have to jump the fence. Thank you very much.